In a complex and increasingly strained diplomatic situation, the United States has stated that Israel's actions regarding humanitarian aid into Gaza do not violate U.S. law, while also calling for further improvements to facilitate assistance in the besieged region. This stance follows heightened scrutiny over Israel's military actions and its treatment of Gaza's civilian population, with the Biden administration aiming to balance its commitment to Israel's security with pressure to ensure humanitarian considerations in Gaza. Just 1 month ago, Washington issued a stark warning that it might withhold military support if humanitarian measures were not improved, a potential move that underscored the rising tensions within U.S.-Israeli relations amid the worsening situation in Gaza. The Biden administration's cautious response follows mounting criticism from international bodies, particularly the United Nations, which has condemned Israel's actions in Gaza as acts of daily cruelty and likened them to some of the gravest international crimes. These remarks came from a senior UN official who underscored the dire humanitarian crisis facing Gaza's civilians, emphasizing the catastrophic impact of sustained bombardments and the severe restrictions on essential goods, including food, water, medical supplies, and fuel. This sentiment is echoed by human rights organizations, which argue that the civilian toll in Gaza highlights a moral and legal imperative for greater humanitarian access and protections. The U.S. position suggests an attempt to maintain diplomatic alignment with Israel while also addressing the demands from various international actors and its domestic audience, which increasingly calls for accountability and humanitarian intervention. Washington's response marks a delicate balancing act. Israel is one of its closest allies, receiving substantial military aid and political support, yet the Biden administration has recently faced intensifying demands to re-evaluate this support as the Gaza situation grows more dire. A month ago, U.S. officials issued a rare public warning to Israel, suggesting that ongoing military assistance could be jeopardized if humanitarian provisions were not addressed. Although Israel responded with some gestures toward allowing aid into Gaza, the incremental nature of these measures has led the U.S. to reiterate its call for more substantive steps. Despite the U.S. acknowledgement that Israel is not violating legal thresholds related to humanitarian aid, the Biden administration's language highlights a cautious, conditional approach, signaling that U.S. support could be contingent on additional progress. Over the past month, Israel has permitted limited aid shipments into Gaza, citing security concerns as the rationale for the restrictions. However, these steps have been viewed by international observers as insufficient to meet the overwhelming need in the region, where basic infrastructure has been decimated, and nearly 2 million residents face critical shortages of food, clean water, medical care, and power. The UN statements reflect a growing frustration with what it sees as disproportionate use of force in Gaza. The senior official's remarks drew attention to the scale of the destruction in Gaza, condemning both the human suffering and the broader implications for international law. The UN has repeatedly highlighted the impact on children, families, and medical facilities, pointing out that the sustained attacks have had a devastating impact on Gaza's health infrastructure and disrupted access to essential services. Furthermore, UN officials and other human rights bodies have raised the alarm over the psychological and physical toll on Gaza's civilian population, who, with limited means of escape, are subjected to daily bombardments and the persistent threat of violence. In the broader international arena, the situation in Gaza has fueled widespread protests and heightened tensions, particularly in the Middle East, where regional actors have vocally condemned Israel's actions and called for greater intervention from global powers. The UN's pointed critique, describing the conditions in Gaza as reminiscent of the gravest international crimes, signals a shift toward a more forceful condemnation of Israel's policies and their human cost. This condemnation aligns with the views of several other international human rights organizations, which have also called for independent investigations into alleged war crimes in Gaza and have urged the international community to hold Israel accountable for its actions. The humanitarian crisis has drawn renewed attention to the complex dynamics of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, where Washington faces the challenge of supporting its long-standing ally Israel while addressing global and domestic pressures for a more balanced approach that acknowledges the rights and needs of Palestinians. Within the US, there has been a notable rise in public discourse advocating for Palestinian rights and a push for the administration to use its leverage to promote a fairer approach. Members of Congress from both parties have voiced concerns, with some advocating for conditions on military aid to Israel as a means to incentivize greater humanitarian considerations in Gaza. These internal and external pressures put the Biden administration in a position of navigating between its alliance with Israel and the imperative to uphold principles of international law and human rights. While Israel's assurances of allowing aid have momentarily alleviated immediate threats to its US support, it remains unclear whether these steps will satisfy calls for a more comprehensive solution to the crisis in Gaza. Observers suggest that the administration's call for further progress may reflect a strategy of continuous engagement, using phased demands to pressure Israel incrementally while avoiding a potentially destabilizing break in relations. In summary, the United States' latest statement on Israel's handling of humanitarian aid into Gaza, while affirming Israel's compliance with US law, also underscores a nuanced approach that insists on further actions to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. As the UN and other international voices intensify their criticisms, the Biden administration's careful calibration of its stance reflects the intricate balancing act it faces, upholding its alliance with Israel while responding to international and domestic calls for greater accountability and humanitarian intervention in Gaza. This complex dynamic illustrates the challenges inherent in US Middle East policy, where security interests, humanitarian concerns, and diplomatic relationships often pull in different directions, leaving Washington to carefully navigate a path forward amidst ongoing conflict and profound humanitarian need.